I knew I'd finally had enough the morning I stepped outside and saw the HOA president, Caroline Briggs herself, standing in my private driveway, screaming into her phone and pointing at my house like I'd committed a crime. Her SUV was half parked across my concrete, blocking me in for the third time that week. Except this time, she wasn't yelling at me. She was calling 911 on me, and all because my new Rottweiler, Diesel, was calmly sitting at the edge of my driveway, refusing to let her temporarily borrow the space again like she'd been doing for weeks. She wanted to twist the story, make me the villain, use her HOA title to bulldoze my boundaries, just like she'd done since the day she moved in. But what she didn't know was this. I was done being polite, I was done being walked over, and I had a plan that would end her driveway invasion once and for all, so perfectly, so cleanly that even the police would take my side in the end. Before we dive into the full story, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. And if you've ever dealt with a power-hungry HOA, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss how this ends. When I first moved into Cedar Ridge Estates 8 years ago, I thought I'd found the perfect balance between quiet suburban comfort and just enough breathing room to feel like the property was truly mine. I bought my home outright, every square foot, every inch of that driveway, every slat of cedar fencing. I didn't mind the HOA. In fact, during those first few years, I barely noticed it. I was the kind of guy who maintained his yard, kept the trash bins where they needed to be, and didn't bother anyone. I assumed that meant nobody would bother me. Then Caroline Briggs moved in. She arrived with the energy of a woman who believed the world operated just slightly beneath her feet. Newly elected HOA president within weeks, she wore her authority like a crown clipboards, reflective vest, and a permanent expression that said she was deeply disappointed in everyone around her. At first, her presence felt more like a nuisance than a threat. Overly harsh emails about trash cans being visible for more than 6 minutes after collection, threats of fines for decorative garden lights that were too warm in color, or her relentless habit of repositioning neighbors' flower pots when she felt their arrangement lacked symmetry. Just typical HOA, pettiness, annoying, but survivable. But then came the driveway problem. The first time she parked in my driveway, I assumed she'd gotten turned around. Maybe she'd been waving at a neighbor and accidentally swung too wide. I walked outside, smiled, tapped lightly on her window, and said, "Hey Caroline, I think you parked in the wrong spot. That's my private driveway." She didn't apologize. She didn't even look embarrassed. She just shrugged. "I'll only be a minute." I expected her to move the car. She didn't. That should have been my sign right there that this woman wasn't operating on the same wavelength as the rest of us, but I let it go. I told myself it wasn't worth a fight. Everyone gets stressed during moving week, right? Except it didn't stop after moving week, or the week after that. By month 2, it became routine. I'd come home from work, and her silver SUV would be angled across my driveway like it was part of the landscaping. Sometimes it blocked me from pulling in, sometimes it blocked me from pulling out, and every time, she'd emerge from somewhere, one hand in the air like she was shooing a fly. "I'll be just a minute, Mark." A minute was never a minute. The problem wasn't just the inconvenience, it was the disrespect, a subtle, steady erosion of boundaries I'd worked my entire life to secure. My driveway wasn't just concrete. It represented something personal. It was the one place no one else should have authority over. So, I tried being diplomatic. A polite conversation on a Saturday morning, a friendly reminder in an email, even a printed copy of the HOA, CC, and R, highlighting that driveways are privately owned, all of it ignored. Then came the violation notice, a bright orange slip taped to my door, informing me that my trash bin had been left out for an unacceptable duration. Never mind that every bin on the street had been out the same amount of time. Never mind that Caroline herself had been the one blocking my driveway that morning, forcing me to take the long route around the neighborhood and delaying my trash run. It was clear what she was doing, retaliation masquerading as governance. Every time I confronted her, her responses felt rehearsed, dripping with superiority. "You need to be more flexible," she'd say. "Driveways are visual community assets. We all do our part." That last one nearly made me laugh. She wasn't doing anything except making sure everyone around her knew she was in charge. I started documenting everything, not because I wanted to escalate the situation, but because I could feel myself reaching a breaking point. Photos of her SUV blocking the entrance, timestamps, screenshots of the emails she sent. Even short clips on my phone when she claimed she was just grabbing a package and then vanished for 40 minutes. Still, I tried to solve it the right way. I filed an official complaint with the HOA board. The board, however, was little more than Carolyn and her loyal cheerleaders, a small group of neighbors who liked the illusion of order more than the reality of fairness. My complaint went nowhere. In fact, I received a response implying that I was being territorial and unneighborly, and that accepting occasional driveway use would strengthen community harmony. Community harmony. That phrase alone nearly made me grind my teeth. Then came the day that changed everything, not because it was the worst thing she'd ever done, but because it was the final straw. It was a Tuesday morning. I had a major virtual presentation with a new client, the kind of opportunity you wake up early for. I dressed professionally, reviewed my notes, and headed toward my car with 10 minutes to spare. And there it was, Caroline's SUV parked diagonally across my driveway, blocking me in so tightly I couldn't maneuver around it even if I'd wanted to. I knocked on her door. No answer. Called her phone, straight to voicemail. She finally strolled back 10 minutes later, latte in hand, sunglasses perched on her head. "Oh, relax," she said breezily. "You weren't leaving yet. I saw your lights off. You do realize this is my private driveway." I snapped something I rarely did. "You can't keep doing this." She smirked, unfazed. "I'm the HOA president, Mark. I'm permitted to use spaces temporarily during community tasks. What community task requires you to block my car in?" She waved the question away. "Don't be dramatic. I missed the presentation, and the client chose another contractor." That evening, I sat alone in my living room, the tension settling in my chest like a coiled spring. I'd tried everything: conversation, documentation, the HOA process, patience, but Caroline wasn't interested in respecting boundaries. She cared only about control. Every dismissal, every shrug, every "you're overreacting" was her way of asserting power. Something had to change, and it had to change in a way she couldn't manipulate, twist, or talk her way around. That was when the idea came to me, not out of anger, but out of clarity. If she wouldn't respect my words, she would have to respect my presence, or, more specifically, the presence of someone who understood boundaries far better than she ever would. A protector, a deterrent, a living, breathing reminder that my driveway was not hers, a dog, not just any dog, a dog that could stand its ground. I didn't want aggression, I didn't want chaos, I wanted authority, calm, quiet, unmistakable authority. So while the sun set behind the ridge that night, painting the neighborhood gold, I opened my laptop and began searching local shelters for large breeds: shepherds, mastiffs, Rottweilers, anything with the kind of stature that made people think twice before crossing a line. And then I saw him. A massive Rottweiler named Diesel, sitting tall, chest broad, eyes steady, intelligent, almost thoughtful. The description read, protective, loyal, disciplined, ideal for experienced handlers. I leaned back in my chair, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a spark of hope. I didn't know exactly how things would unfold, but I knew one thing for certain. Caroline Briggs had just parked in my driveway for the last time. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual. Maybe it was excitement. Maybe it was the relief of finally taking control of a situation that had been draining me for weeks. Or maybe it was the simple feeling that today, something in my life was about to shift. I brewed coffee, sat at the dining table, and stared out the window at my driveway. For the first time in months, it was empty. No silver SUV, no unwanted surprises, just clean concrete and quiet morning sun spilling across it like a blank slate. It felt symbolic. After breakfast, I drove across town to the rescue shelter where Diesel was being kept. The volunteer at the front desk recognized his name immediately. "Oh, Diesel," she said with a sympathetic smile. "He's a big sweetheart once he trusts you, but he's very protective. He's been returned twice because people didn't understand what a working breed really needs." I nodded. "I'm not looking for a lapdog." "Good," she said, "because he's definitely not one." When she led me into the back area, Diesel was lying in a corner of his kennel, front paws crossed, head up, ears alert. He was massive, bigger than I expected, with that unmistakable Rottweiler posture. Confident, calm, aware of everything happening in the room. But what struck me was his stillness. He didn't jump, he didn't bark, he just observed. The volunteer unclipped his kennel door. "Diesel, this is Mark. Be gentle." Diesel stood slowly, walked up to me, and lifted his head so our eyes met. I don't know how to explain it. Maybe it was projection, maybe wishful thinking, but it felt like he was assessing me, like he was deciding, on the spot, whether I was worth his loyalty. I extended my hand, letting him sniff. He licked my knuckles once, sat down, and leaned ever so slightly against my leg. The volunteer raised her eyebrows. Well, that's a very good sign. I didn't hesitate. I'll take him. The adoption paperwork felt like signing a peace treaty with myself, a promise that I was no longer going to let Caroline push me around. Diesel wasn't a weapon. He wasn't revenge. He was a boundary, a line she couldn't cross without confronting something larger than her ego. On the drive home, Diesel sat upright in the back seat, occasionally glancing out the window at passing cars. Every time I stopped at a light, his reflection stared back at me from the rearview mirror, calm, steady, unshakable, exactly what I needed. When we arrived home, I opened the back door, and Diesel hopped down onto the driveway. He sniffed the air, paced the perimeter twice, then sat right at the edge of the concrete, facing the road like it was his natural post. "That's your spot," I murmured. "Good boy." He didn't look at me, but his tail gave a small, single thump against the ground. I spent the rest of the day prepping, installing motion sensor cameras, repositioning my doorbell cam to capture the entire driveway, and printing out official-looking signs that read, "Private driveway, no unauthorized parking, security monitoring in use." Yes, it was dramatic, but subtlety hadn't gotten me anywhere with Caroline. Around late afternoon, I walked Diesel around the property, keeping him leashed while he explored the yard, sniffed the fence line, and occasionally tested the boundaries of where he wanted to pull versus where I needed him to stay. He was strong, easily over 100 pounds, but impressively responsive. A quick tug, a soft hey, and he adjusted. By evening, we'd already established a rhythm. When a car drove by, Diesel lifted his head, ears pricking forward, but he never barked. He just watched, judging, calculating, choosing whether the vehicle was a threat worth reacting to. Nothing passed his attention, not even a leaf. And that was perfect. 2 days passed before Caroline made her next appearance. It was just after 9 a.m., and I was standing in the living room, watching the morning news, Diesel resting at my feet like a furry boulder. He suddenly stood, ears forward, and walked to the window. I followed his gaze, and there it was, Caroline's silver SUV rolling down the street toward my driveway with its usual slow, entitled glide. The same angle of approach, the same casual assumption that the concrete she was looking at somehow belonged to her. Diesel looked back at me as if asking, "Is this the one?" I opened the front door and stepped onto the porch. Caroline didn't even notice me. She didn't notice Diesel either, not until her front tires were inches from the driveway. Diesel walked forward, positioning himself right at the opening, tall, broad, immovable. Caroline slammed the brakes so hard her SUV dipped forward. She stared. Diesel stared back. I could practically feel the tension humming between them like a power line ready to snap. Caroline rolled down her window, face twisted in disbelief. "Move your dog, Mark." Diesel didn't move a muscle. I leaned against the porch rail. He's on my property, and unlike some people, he respects boundaries. Her jaw clenched. "I have HOA business to handle. I need quick access." "You know that—" "No," I said calmly. "What I know is that you've been using my driveway as your personal parking space. That ends today. This is harassment." She snapped. "You trained your dog to intimidate me." "I trained my dog to guard the place he lives," I replied, "which includes my driveway." "Move him," she repeated, voice rising. "Right now." Diesel took one step forward, not aggressive, not loud, just enough to make his presence unmistakable. Caroline jerked back like he'd leapt at her. I held up both hands. "He's not attacking you. He's doing his job. If you don't want to interact with him, steer clear of my driveway." Her hand flew to her phone. "I'm calling the police." Of course she was. I didn't argue, didn't try to de-escalate. I'd played that role too many times already. Instead, I said, "Go ahead," and then I turned and walked back inside, leaving Diesel calmly watching her through the open gate. She dialed frantically. I could hear her voice escalating through the window as she spun a story about a threatening guard dog and a homeowner using intimidation tactics. Diesel wandered back to the porch, sat beside me, and placed his huge head on my knee like he was bored with the whole ordeal. "Good boy," I whispered, scratching behind his ears. "Just wait. The truth will speak for itself." The police arrived in less than 10 minutes, 2 cruisers, lights flashing but sirens off. Small town calm, big-time authority. I stepped onto the porch as they approached, Diesel sitting obediently beside me. Caroline ran up to them immediately, waving her arms, pointing at Diesel, claiming she'd been blocked, threatened, and cornered by my dog. One of the officers asked her to stay by her vehicle while they assessed the situation. They approached Diesel cautiously, not because he was aggressive, but because protocol demanded it. Diesel didn't growl, didn't bark, didn't break eye contact with them. He just sat there like a statue of silent judgment. "Sir," one officer said, "does your dog have a history of aggression?" "No," I said, handing over his adoption papers, vaccination records, and training assessment. "He's protective, but not violent." "Did he chase her, bark at her, lunge?" "No," I said, and then motioned to my camera system. "You can see for yourselves." Within minutes, they reviewed the footage. Caroline's car approaching, Diesel walking into position, her slamming the brakes, and Diesel simply standing still. The officer exhaled slowly and turned to his partner. "Yeah, that's not aggression," Caroline overheard and stormed toward us, shouting that we were ignoring the real threat and that HOA rules supersede driveway ownership. The officer held up a hand. "Ma'am, HOA rules do not override private property rights. This homeowner has every legal right to keep you off his driveway. His dog did nothing wrong." Her face drained of color. But mine, for the first time in a long time, I felt something close to relief. And I had the sense we were only getting started. Caroline didn't take the officer's verdict quietly. Of course she didn't. The moment they finished explaining that Diesel had done absolutely nothing wrong, her entire posture shifted from outrage to disbelief, and then to something almost theatrical, like she was performing for an invisible audience that would surely validate her. She threw her hands up, pacing in a small, tight circle like a kettle about to whistle. "So, that's it," she snapped. "You're just going to let him use a dangerous dog to intimidate an HOA officer in the line of duty." Both officers exchanged a long, exhausted look, the kind you only see from professionals who deal with unnecessary drama on a near-daily basis. "Ma'am," the taller officer said, "you're not an officer, you're an HOA president. That doesn't give you authority to park on someone else's driveway or override their property rights." The shorter officer chimed in, calm but firm. "And from the footage we reviewed, the dog didn't display any aggressive behavior. He stood his ground on his property. That is not illegal." Carolyn pointed at Diesel like she was accusing him of tax fraud. "He moved toward my car. He stepped forward. That counts as nothing," the officer cut in. "If he wanted to attack, trust me, you would know." I could see the exact second her confidence cracked. Her eyebrows twitched, her mouth opened, closed, opened again. The gears were turning, but nothing good was coming out. And then she pivoted hard. "If you won't do anything," she declared loudly, "then I'll be filing a formal complaint with the county, and the board, and animal control, and I'll make sure every neighbor knows what's going on here." The officer remained unshaken. "You're free to file complaints, ma'am, but wasting emergency services is a separate issue." Caroline froze for half a second. "Excuse me, you exaggerated the emergency," the officer said. "You claimed the dog was attacking you. That's a misuse of 911. He pulled out a citation booklet. Caroline's reaction was instantaneous, her face contorted like she'd bitten into a lemon. "You can't find me, I'm the HOA president." The officer didn't blink. "Ma'am, I can, and I will." He began writing. I didn't smile, though God knows I wanted to. Instead, I folded my arms, watching the scene unfold like the universe was finally balancing a very tilted scale. Carolyn sputtered incoherently as the officer handed her the citation. "This is harassment. This is targeted harassment. You're taking his side." "We're taking the side of the law," the officer replied. She stared at the paper as though it were written in a language she refused to learn. Then she crumpled it in her fist and threw it toward her car. That was when I knew we were on the edge of something bigger. She wasn't done, not even close, and I could see it building in her, something boiling, unreasonable, unstoppable. She turned to me slowly, hands shaking, eyes bright with fury. "This isn't over, Mark." I didn't move. It should be. The trembling in her jaw said she wasn't hearing me at all. The officers gave her one last warning to calm down before they left. Caroline didn't calm down. She waited until both cruisers rolled down the street, then stormed across the sidewalk toward my property. Diesel stood instantly. Not in a violent way, just tall, alert, ready. Caroline froze halfway up my driveway. I could see her chest rising and falling as she fought with whatever impulse was on the tip of her tongue. "Get that animal away from me," she barked. "He's not moving," I said calmly. "And neither are you. This is private property. This community doesn't belong to you," she shot back. "As HOA president, I have the authority to—" "No," I said sharply. "You don't." For a moment the air stilled, birds quieted, even the wind seemed to pause, and then Caroline made a mistake so profound I still replay it in my mind. She stepped forward. Diesel didn't lunge, he didn't growl, he simply walked one step closer as well, mirroring her movement, placing himself between her and me. His presence alone was enough. Caroline jerked back like she'd touched fire. "This is intimidation," she shrieked. "This is a setup. You're all conspiring against me." I exhaled. "Caroline, go home." She shook her head violently. "No, no. I will not be disrespected in my own community." "It's not your community," I said. "You don't own this street. You don't own my property. You don't get to make the rules up as you go." Her breathing grew ragged, her fists clenched. For a second, I genuinely wondered whether she was about to grab something, her keys, a rock, anything. Before she had the chance, another voice echoed from behind her. "Ma'am, step back." The officers had returned. Apparently they hadn't driven far. They must have sensed she wouldn't let things go. Caroline turned toward them. "He's threatening me again. That dog is enough," the officer said, raising a hand. "Ma'am, we already addressed this situation." "No, you didn't," she exploded. "You're all letting him get away with this because he's—" The officer cut her off before she went somewhere she'd regret. "Take a breath. Back away from his property." "I will not," she screamed. She tried to march forward again. Diesel didn't move, but the officers did. They jogged up the driveway, intercepting her just before she crossed an obvious boundary. "Ma'am, stop resisting," the taller officer said. "Don't touch me," she shouted, wrenching her arm away. "I know my rights." The shorter officer sighed. Apparently not. The moment she swung her hand, not even a full swing, more like a frantic swat, they grabbed her arms, not aggressively, not violently, just firmly enough to control the situation. Caroline's shriek echoed across the neighborhood. "This is an outrage. You can't do this. I'm the OA president." "You're also trespassing," the officer said, and ignoring multiple lawful commands. Her voice rose another octave. "Let me go. I'm filing charges against all of you." But the officers had already made their decision. They turned her, cuffed her wrists, and began walking her toward the cruiser. The neighborhood came alive, doors opening, blinds shifting, neighbors whispering from their porches. One woman, 2 houses down, murmured, "Finally," another neighbor muttered. About time someone stopped her. Even kids on bicycles rolled to the curb to watch the spectacle. Caroline was red-faced, breathless, half sputtering, half screeching, as the officers guided her forward. "This is illegal. This is retaliatory. I'll sue. I'll have your badges." The officers didn't react. They'd heard it all before. And then Caroline locked eyes with me over her shoulder. "This isn't over," she spat. I met her stare calmly. "Yes," I said, "it is." When the cruiser finally pulled away with Caroline still spitting threats from the back seat, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. Diesel nudged my leg gently, like he was checking in. "Good boy," I whispered, scratching behind his ears. "You did everything right." As the adrenaline cooled, I finally understood something important. The confrontation today wasn't the end of the story, it was the beginning of consequence. Caroline had built her entire identity on control. Being corrected publicly by police, no less, was the kind of humiliation she couldn't bear. She'd try to fight back. She'd try to reclaim whatever power she imagined, slipping through her fingers, but she didn't know something crucial. Something I hadn't told her. Something that would change absolutely everything once it came to light. And the best part, it wasn't a threat. It wasn't revenge. It was simply the truth, a truth Caroline Briggs was about to learn the hard way. The quiet after Caroline's arrest was almost unsettling. For someone who'd spent the past 2 months inserting herself into every corner of the neighborhood, her sudden absence felt like unplugging a machine that had been humming in the background for far too long. Cedar Ridge Estates took a breath, a long, overdue exhale. But peace didn't come instantly. The morning after the incident, I stepped outside with Diesel to take our usual walk around the block. As we crossed my driveway, I noticed several neighbors casually milling about, with the weird kind of coincidence that only happens when people are dying to know what happened but don't want to be obvious about it. Mrs. Green from across the street pretended to water plants that did not need watering. The new couple 2 doors down, Sam and Lena, lingered a little too long by their mailbox. Even Mr. Henderson, who I hadn't seen outside in months, suddenly decided today was a good day to retrieve his morning paper. People weren't subtle. Morning, Mark. Mrs. Green called in a tone far too chipper for 7 a.m. Lovely weather, isn't it? I smiled politely. It is. Her eyes darted to Diesel, then to my driveway, then back to me. She opened her mouth like she was warming up to a question, but nothing came out. Instead, she just kept spritzing the same leaf over and over. Yep, definitely looking for gossip. We kept walking. As Diesel and I rounded the cul-de-sac, a white HOA golf cart turned down the street, rolling toward us. I tensed for a moment. Old habits die hard, but when it pulled up to the curb, I saw it wasn't Caroline at the wheel. It was Jim. Jim Carter had been on the HOA board for years and was widely regarded as one of the few decent human beings in Cedar Ridge governance. He was in his mid-60s, wore glasses that always sat a little crooked, and carried the exhausted aura of someone who had tried for years to keep the peace while being outnumbered by louder personalities. He parked beside me and removed his cap with a sigh. "Mark," he said, "mind if I walk with you a minute?" "Not at all." Jim climbed out of the cart, fell into step beside us, and lowered his voice. I heard about what happened yesterday." "Did you?" I replied, though of course I knew the entire neighborhood had. Jim frowned. "Look, I want to apologize. What Caroline did, none of that reflects the board as a whole." I raised an eyebrow. "Doesn't it?" Jim winced. He knew I had a point. "She's been pushing the limits for a while," he admitted, throwing her weight around, making decisions without consulting anyone, writing citations without approval. "You're not the first one she's targeted." I stopped walking. "So why hasn't anyone said anything?" He shrugged helplessly. "It's complicated. She gets aggressive when challenged. Some people are afraid of conflict, some want to avoid drama, and some, frankly, don't care enough to fight her." "Sounds about right," I muttered. Jim cleared his throat. "The board is having an emergency meeting tonight. Without her, we need to decide what to do next." I didn't respond. I wasn't sure what he expected from me. Jim continued. "If you're willing, we'd like you to provide a statement about the driveway issues, the false citations, the police involvement." "Ah, there it was, Jim," I said gently. "I'm not trying to run a crusade here. I just want to be left alone." "I know," he said quickly, "and you should be. But this incident, it's bigger now. People finally saw her lose control. They saw the officers take her away. If there was ever a time to address her behavior, it's now." Diesel nudged Jim's leg, as if impatient with the conversation. Jim smiled nervously and took a step back. "Big boy, isn't he?" "Big enough," I replied. Jim nodded, adjusted his cap, and climbed back into the golf cart. "I'll email you the meeting details. Hope you'll consider joining." With that, he drove off, leaving me in the middle of the cul-de-sac with a Rottweiler who seemed far more decisive than the entire HOA board combined. That night, I sat at my desk with my laptop open to a folder I'd labeled HOA Nonsense. Inside were dozens of photos, saved emails, video clips, and documentation of every driveway incident I'd endured. At first, I'd collected the evidence because I needed validation that I wasn't imagining the harassment. Now, apparently, it was evidence in an actual HOA proceeding. Funny how life works sometimes. As I looked through the files, a thought surfaced, one I hadn't fully acknowledged until this moment. Caroline hadn't just been annoying. She'd been abusing her position, weaponizing a homeowners association to push around anyone who didn't conform to her vision of perfect community order. And I wasn't just irritated anymore. I was tired of bullies. I clicked print all. By the time the stack of papers landed in the tray, Diesel had curled up beside my chair, snoring softly. I reached down and scratched his head. "You and I said quietly, "are about to shake this place up a little." He didn't wake, but his tail thumped once. The emergency meeting was held in the community clubhouse, an oddly grand building with chandeliers, beige walls, and carpet that smelled permanently like potluck casseroles. When I walked in, half the neighborhood was already there. People whispered as I passed. Not hostile, whispers, supportive ones, curious ones, surprised ones. A few even nodded at me in acknowledgement. Word had gotten around. I took a seat near the front, next to Mrs. Green, who immediately leaned in with excitement she couldn't contain. Is it true she tried to march up your driveway after the police told her not to? It's true. She sucked in a breath. Good heavens. I knew she was intense. But that's another level. At the front of the room, Jim stood behind a folding table with two other board members, Linda, who managed landscaping contracts, and Stuart, who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. Jim cleared his throat. Thank you all for coming. As you know, circumstances require a discussion about recent behavior from our HOA president. Murmurs rippled across the room. Jim gestured toward me. We've asked Mark Reynolds to provide a full account of what happened yesterday and the weeks leading up to it. I stood, walked to the front, and placed my folder of documents on the table, and I told the story, not with theatrics, not with exaggeration, just the truth. How Carolyn had used my driveway, how she'd dismissed my concerns, how she'd issued retaliatory citations, how she'd called 911 with a fabricated emergency, how she'd ignored police instructions and trespassed onto my property. Every piece of evidence backed it up, every timestamp aligned, every clip made her behavior undeniable. When I finished, the room sat in a stunned silence. Then the comments started. She fined me for leaving my hose out for 5 minutes. She told my husband he had to repaint our shutters because she didn't like the shade. She threatened to tow my daughter's car even though it was legally parked. She said my wreath was seasonally inconsistent. One woman, red-faced with frustration, stood up and said, she told me my welcome mat was passive-aggressive. For the first time since moving here, I felt like the neighborhood was united, bound together, not by shared rules, but by shared exhaustion. Jim finally raised his hands for quiet. Based on the evidence presented, the board will vote on whether to temporarily suspend Caroline Briggs from her duties, pending a full review. The vote wasn't close. 3 seconds later, the board announced that Caroline was officially relieved of her position until further notice. The clubhouse erupted in applause. I didn't celebrate. I didn't need to. I just felt the weight in my chest lighten, like a pressure valve had been released. But deep down, I also knew something else. Caroline wasn't going to go quietly. Not after this. Not after being publicly embarrassed. Not after losing the authority she clung to like oxygen. No, this wasn't the end. It was the beginning of the next storm. And I had the uneasy feeling that Diesel and I were going to be right in the center of it. Caroline didn't show her face for 2 days after the emergency HOA meeting, and honestly, that brief stretch of quiet felt almost unnatural. I had grown so used to her SUV edging into my driveway, her clipboard tapping against her wrist like a metronome of irritation, that the absence of conflict was strange, peaceful, yes, but almost suspicious. Like the calm that settles right before a thunderstorm rolls in from behind the ridge. On the morning of the 3rd day, I stepped outside with Diesel, coffee in hand, feeling the crisp air, appreciating once again how the silence made the neighborhood look almost picturesque. Kids waiting for the school bus, neighbors walking their dogs, sprinklers clicking across manicured lawns. It was the kind of peaceful scene HOA brochures loved to brag about. For the first time in months, Cedar Ridge really felt like the community I'd imagined when I moved here. But peace rarely lasts long when someone like Caroline Briggs is involved. Diesel suddenly stiffened beside me, ears forward, tail low, not in fear, but in focus. He had a way of detecting tension before I did, like he could smell trouble. I followed his gaze to the far end of the street. Carolyn's silver SUV had returned. She drove slower this time. No wild speed, no reckless confidence, just a slow, creeping roll toward my property, as if she was stalking from a distance, collecting data, rehearsing. Diesel watched her the entire way, unmoving, a sentinel carved from muscle and discipline. I didn't move either. Caroline stopped her SUV directly across the street from my driveway. She didn't get out, she didn't wave, she didn't yell. She just sat there behind the tinted glass, staring. Minutes passed. Finally, the driver's window rolled down. Caroline leaned out, sunglasses covering half her face. "You think you've won, don't you?" she said, her voice steady but laced with venom. I didn't respond at first. I wasn't going to take the bait. "Caroline," I finally said, "I'm not interested in winning anything. I just want you to stop violating my property." "So dramatic," she snapped. "You and your stupid dog are making everyone think I'm some kind of criminal." "I didn't make anyone think anything," I replied. "Your actions did." She clenched her jaw so hard I could see the muscles twitch. "Don't worry," she said through her teeth. "I'm working on something. You'll see." Then she drove off abruptly, tires squeaking, not peeling out in anger, but in frustration that didn't know where else to go. Diesel exhaled sharply, like even he was tired of her. I glanced down at him. "Yeah," I muttered. "I have a feeling she's far from finished." At the HOA board's request, I stayed in regular contact with Jim over the next few days. He updated me on the formal suspension process, the complaints being reviewed, and the fact that several board members were quietly relieved to finally have the chance to address the problems they'd been avoiding. But the more the board talked about Caroline, the more I realized just how many skirmishes she had created across the community. She fined a retired couple for hanging a hummingbird feeder too low. She threatened to tow a teenager's car for being parked at an angle she personally found unacceptable. She told a widower his porch chair cushions clashed with the HOA color palette. She issued a citation to a woman for having too many ceramic frogs in her garden. And the worst part, most people had simply complied, not because she was right, but because they didn't want to deal with her wrath. Her power had never come from authority, it came from intimidation. And now that intimidation had backfired, Jim called me one evening with an update. "It's not official yet," he said, "but I think the board is going to move for permanent removal." "That makes sense," I said. "But be prepared," Jim added. "She's not going to accept it quietly. I never expected her to." We hung up. I turned to find Diesel lying at the doorway, blocking the entrance like he always did at night, never fully asleep, just resting, ready. "You might be getting busier soon," I said to him. He blinked, unimpressed. The next incident came sooner than expected. It was a Saturday afternoon. I had decided to do some yard work, raking leaves, clearing gutters, the kind of chores you only do when you're trying to distract yourself from impending chaos. Diesel lounged near the porch, eyes half open, soaking in the sun like a solar panel. I had just gathered the last pile of leaves when I noticed a car I didn't recognize pull into the neighborhood. It wasn't a neighbor's vehicle. It wasn't a contractor's truck. It was a dark sedan, with tinted windows and no front license plate. It drove slowly, too slowly, coasting past houses like it was mapping the area. Diesel lifted his head and watched. The sedan slowed even more when it passed my house. Pausing just long enough to make me uneasy, Diesel stood. The car continued down the road and disappeared around the corner. I didn't like it, neither did Diesel. I mentioned it to Jim an hour later. "That's odd," he said. "We don't have anyone scheduled for appraisals or inspections today." Something about the tone in his voice made me tense. "Do you think Caroline might be involved?" Jim sighed. "Nothing would surprise me at this point." I ended the call feeling a knot in my stomach. That night, around 11 p.m., I heard something that instantly sent adrenaline through my veins. The sound of footsteps outside my house. Not heavy, not subtle, just slow, creeping steps across gravel. Diesel reacted before I could even stand. He bolted to the front window, hackles raised, letting out a low rumble I had never heard from him before. I approached the window and peeked through the blinds. Someone stood in the shadows near the corner of my property. Not a neighbor, not a kid, an adult, hooded, tall, intentionally trying not to be seen. He was holding something in his hand. Diesel growled deeper, chest rumbling like distant thunder. Then the person stepped closer, just enough for the motion sensor light to flick on. The bright white beam flooded the driveway, illuminating the trespasser, and I felt my stomach drop. It wasn't some stranger. It was Caroline. What she held in her hand wasn't a clipboard. It was a stack of papers and a camera. She raised the camera and took multiple photos of my house, my yard, my windows, my security sign, everything. Diesel barked, loud enough to shake the glass. Caroline flinched. Stepping back, I flung the door open. "Caroline!" She froze, her face pale and strained in the light. "What are you doing on my property?" She lifted her chin, a brittle, fragile defiance. "Gathering evidence." "For what?" "For your violations." I stared at her, speechless. "You've been suspended from the HOA. Temporarily," she hissed, "and I will get reinstated. But first, I'm documenting all the rule-breaking happening at your house." "What rule-breaking?" "The dog, the cameras, the signs, the landscaping that's not in compliance, the—" "Caroline," I interrupted, "everything I've done is within HOA regulations. You think that matters?" she snapped. "Once I'm back in charge, I'll rewrite the rules if I have to." Diesel stepped forward, planting himself between us. Caroline backed up instinctively. "This isn't over," she said again, breath trembling. "It won't be over until I say it is." Then she turned and hurried back toward the street, disappearing into the dark. I stood there for a long time, watching the shadows, listening for any hint she might return. Diesel didn't move from his post. Eventually, I closed the door and locked it. I realized then that the storm hadn't passed. It had only started gathering strength, and if Caroline was willing to sneak onto my property in the middle of the night to take photos, then her next move would be even more desperate, something bigger, something reckless, something dangerous. Diesel sat beside me, watching, waiting. I placed a hand on his head. "Good boy," I whispered. "Stay close. Tomorrow's going to be a long day." By sunrise the next morning, I was already awake, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee I'd completely forgotten to drink. Diesel lay at my feet, but even he sensed something was wrong. His sleep was light, ears twitching at every small noise outside. I kept replaying the image of Caroline in my driveway the night before. The shadows across her face, the stack of papers, the camera, the way she said, "It won't be over until I say it is." Normal HOA presidents don't sneak onto private property at 11 p.m. Normal people don't behave like trespassers casing a house. This wasn't a rule dispute anymore. This was obsession. Around 7:30 a.m., I heard footsteps on the porch. Diesel lifted his head and emitted a low growl, not aggressive, just alert. I checked the peephole. It was Jim. I opened the door. "You're up early." He removed his cap. Tired lines etched across his face. "Mind if I come in?" I stepped aside. Diesel sniffed him, relaxed, then lay back down near my chair. Jim sat, exhaling heavily. "We need to talk." "That sounds serious." "It is," he said. "Caroline showed up to the HOA office this morning." I blinked. I thought she was suspended. "She is?" But she stormed in anyway. Told the administrative assistant she was still the rightful president and demanded records. She said she was filing a petition to overturn her suspension based on unlawful bias. I rubbed my temples. She's spiraling. "That's not the half of it," Jim continued. "She accused the board of conspiring with you, said we were weaponizing the HOA against her, said you'd been harassing her for months." A humorless laugh escaped me. "That's rich." Jim nodded. "She also claimed you set a dog trap for her." "A dog trap?" I repeated. "What even—" "I know," he said, waving a hand. "It's nonsense, but she's trying every angle she can think of." "And Mark? I don't think she's done escalating." "Yeah," I said slowly. "She was on my property last night." Jim stared at me, eyes wide. "Doing what?" I told him everything. The camera, the photos, the threats. Jim sunk deeper into his chair. "Jesus," he murmured. "This is worse than I thought." "What's our next step?" I asked. Jim hesitated. "Honestly, we may need to involve someone above the HOA, county code enforcement, possibly even law enforcement. For trespassing. For harassment," Jim corrected. "Persistent harassment, fueled by her abuse of authority. The board will back you. You have evidence. And judging by how erratic she's become, I think she's close to crossing a line she can't walk back." I nodded slowly. "Then let's get ahead of it." Jim left soon after, promising to call an emergency board meeting that evening. As soon as he was out of sight, I looked down at Diesel. "We're not done yet, buddy." He thumped his tail twice, as if he understood exactly what was coming. The rest of the day crept by with uncomfortable stillness. Diesel remained on alert, following me room to room, checking the windows, pacing whenever a car passed. By late afternoon, I noticed something strange. A white sedan, different from the dark one I'd seen earlier, kept driving around the block. Slow, measured, almost deliberate. It circled once, twice, a third time. Each time, Diesel bristled, tail stiff, eyes following it like a predator tracking prey. By the fourth pass, my patience snapped. I walked out onto the sidewalk, waving my arm to flag the driver down. The vehicle slowed, then accelerated sharply and disappeared around the corner. I stood in the street for a long moment, anger rising in my chest. This wasn't coincidence. This was surveillance. Night fell, and with night came the true tension. I barely slept the night before, and the exhaustion clung to me like residue, but adrenaline kept me moving. Alert to every sound outside, Diesel positioned himself in the hallway near the front door, a silent sentinel. At exactly 9:17 p.m., my motion sensor camera pinged on my phone. I snatched it immediately. There she was, Caroline Briggs, standing at the edge of my driveway again, this time clutching not a camera but a tape measure. She extended it toward the ground, taking measurements of the width of my driveway, my walkway, even part of my fence line. She scribbled notes furiously on a clipboard. As if that wasn't enough, she crouched down and pressed something against the edge of my driveway. I zoomed in, her cell phone, recording. I stepped outside. Caroline, she jolted upright, spinning around. Her face was pale in the glow of the street lamp, eyes wild, hair messy as if she'd been pacing for hours before working up the nerve to come here. "What do you think you're doing?" I asked. "Documenting violations," she snapped. "There are no violations. There will be," she said, voice trembling with manic certainty. "I know what you're hiding." "Hiding," I repeated. "What exactly do you think I'm—" "You've been manipulating this entire neighborhood," she hissed, "turning people against me, using that animal to intimidate me." Diesel stepped onto the porch behind me, massive silhouette framed against the light. Caroline flinched so violently she nearly dropped her clipboard. "Call him off." "He's not coming near you," I said firmly. "He's here for my safety." "My safety is the one at risk," she shrieked. "No," I said. "Your behavior is out of control, and this needs to stop." Something inside her cracked at that. Her shoulders slumped, then straightened, then slumped again. She seemed unsure whether to cry or scream. Finally, she whispered, "You ruined everything." Then she stepped back, into the street, into the path of an approaching police cruiser. The cruiser braked immediately. I blinked, but Caroline didn't. She marched straight to the officer's window and began pounding on it with the palm of her hand. "You," she yelled, "arrest him now." Diesel barked once sharp, explosive at the sudden escalation. The officer stepped out. "Ma'am, calm down." "No," she screamed. "He's threatening me. He's recording me illegally. He's using that beast to stalk me." "Ma'am, stop. You don't understand. He's the one who should be handcuffed. Ma'am," the officer repeated, more stern now. "You need to step back." Her voice cracked. "I won't." She shoved the officer. A collective gasp echoed from the houses lining the street. Porch lights flicked on one by one. The officer grabbed her wrists. "Ma'am, you're under arrest for assault and—" "No," she wailed. "No. This is his fault. This is all his doing." She jerked back violently, nearly knocking herself off balance. "Stop resisting," the officer warned. "I will not." The struggle lasted only seconds. Soon the officer and his partner had her restrained and cuffed. She was still screaming my name as they guided her into the back of the cruiser. "This is your fault. This is your dog. This is your plan. I'll destroy you for this." Her voice grew distant as the cruiser pulled away, but the echo of her rage lingered in the air like smoke after a fire. The neighborhood went silent. Diesel pressed against my leg, steady and grounding. I exhaled slowly. It was over, or, at least, the worst of it was, but I knew one thing as I stood beneath the streetlight, watching the patrol car disappear. The fallout had only just begun, and the next part, the part where everything unraveled for Caroline and the HOA she used as her kingdom, was already in motion. The night Caroline was taken away for the second time felt strangely quiet, not peaceful quiet in that tense, suspended way a neighborhood feels after witnessing something explosive. People lingered at their windows long after the cruiser disappeared. Blinds slightly cracked, porch lights glowing like watchful eyes. Diesel rested beside me on the porch, the weight of his head warm on my knee. While I tried to process everything that had just happened, Caroline wasn't just spiraling now, she was free-falling. And even though I'd done nothing to provoke her, nothing to escalate the situation, I knew deep in my bones she would come back from this angrier, more desperate, and more determined to reclaim the power she believed belonged to her. But for the moment, the night settled. Around 1 a.m., Diesel finally nudged me with his nose, his way of telling me I'd been sitting too long in one place. With too many thoughts swirling in my head, I stood, locked up the house, and tried to get some sleep. Tomorrow would bring fallout. I just didn't realize how much. I woke to a knock on my door at 8:12 a.m. Diesel reached it before I did, sniffing, then relaxing once he recognized the scent. When I opened the door, Jim stood there, clutching a folder stuffed with documents. His expression told me everything before he said a word. "Well," he sighed, "things have escalated." "They were already escalated," I reminded him. Jim nodded. "And now the county is involved." He walked inside, set the folder on my kitchen table, and rubbed his forehead. Last night's arrest triggered a mandatory review. When the officers reported she was trespassing, shouting, refusing commands, and accusing half the neighborhood of conspiring against her, the county opened an inquiry into her previous HOA actions. "What does that mean exactly?" I asked. "It means they're investigating her entire tenure as president. Every fine, every citation, every decision she ever signed off on." That explained the stack of documents. "And," Jim continued, lowering his voice, "your footage is the strongest evidence in their file." Diesel sprawled across the floor beside me, looking up as if he understood his star witness status. "What are they planning to do with the evidence?" I asked. Jim exhaled. "Disciplinary action, mandatory removal, and, possibly the big one, civil penalties for abuse of authority." I blinked. "Civil penalties? Against her personally?" "Yes," he confirmed. "Not the HOA. Her." For a moment, I felt a flicker of something like pity. Caroline had built her entire identity around controlling Cedar Ridge. She lived, breathed, and weaponized her position with tunnel vision obsession. To her, the HOA wasn't a volunteer role. It was a crown, and now that crown was being melted down in front of her. But then I remembered her screaming at police officers, her trespassing into my yard in the dark, her filing false citations, her calling 911 over nothing, her standing with a tape measure in my driveway, convinced she could prove I was breaking some rule she hadn't even invented yet. No, pity wasn't the right emotion. Relief was. Jim tapped the folder. "The board is voting tonight. If all goes well, she'll be permanently removed." "And if it doesn't go well?" I asked. Jim shrugged. "Then we'll deal with whatever nonsense comes next." By mid-afternoon, the neighborhood had fallen into a strange quiet again. People walked slower, conversations hushed when I passed by. Not out of avoidance, if anything. There was a new kind of respect there, as if Diesel and I had stood against something bigger than an HOA, that we'd confronted a bully no one else knew how to confront. A few neighbors waved. Mrs. Green even brought over a plate of banana bread and whispered, "You didn't deserve any of that nonsense, dear." "I hope it's finally coming to an end." I thanked her, though I wasn't convinced yet, because Caroline wasn't predictable, and people like her didn't surrender quietly. By 5 p.m., I put Diesel's leash on and took him for a walk, anything to ease the knot in my stomach. He trotted beside me, head high, protective but relaxed. We rounded the corner near Lot 18, the house with the always crooked shutters, when a familiar car caught my eye. A silver SUV, parked halfway down the block, facing my direction. My chest tightened. "Caroline?" I whispered under my breath. Diesel stiffened, confirming it. He recognized her scent or her presence before I even saw her. The driver's side door cracked open, and she stepped out. Her hair was disheveled, her clothes wrinkled, her eyes wide with something between panic and fury. She looked like she hadn't slept. Like every ounce of control she'd ever clung to had slipped through her fingers overnight. "Mark Reynolds," she shouted. Neighbors peeked from porches. A curtain shifted across the street. I held onto Diesel's leash firmly. "Caroline, go home." "You did this to me," she yelled, voice cracking. "You turned everyone against me. You ruined my reputation." "I didn't ruin anything," I said. "Your actions caught up with you." "Lies," she screamed. "You manipulated the board. You manipulated the county. You staged everything." Diesel growled, not loud but deep, a warning resonating from his chest. Caroline's eyes darted to him. "You trained that animal to threaten me." I shook my head. "Diesel isn't a threat unless you make yourself one." She clenched her fists. "I'll fix this. I'll fix all of it." She took a step forward. Diesel positioned himself in front of me, body tense, tail straight. "Caroline," I warned, "don't come any closer." But she was shaking now, not with fear, with something more unhinged. This community was mine to run, mine, and you destroyed it. A car horn blared from behind us. Police? Again. 2 cruisers pulled up, lights flashing but no sirens. The officers stepped out, familiar faces by now. "Ma'am," one officer called, "we need you to stop right there." Caroline ignored him. She took another step. Diesel barked loud and sharp. Caroline screamed and stumbled backward, tripping over the curb. The officers rushed in immediately. "Ma'am, stay where you are." "No," she shrieked. "He's attacking me. Arrest him. Arrest." Her words were cut off as 2 officers gently but firmly restrained her arms. She fought, screamed, kicked at the pavement, insisted Diesel had lunged at her, even though half the street and 2 police body cams had witnessed the opposite. Within moments, she was in handcuffs again. This time, she wasn't yelling at me. She was sobbing, broken, unraveled. As she was guided toward the cruiser, she looked back at me one last time, not with hatred, with confusion, as if she still didn't understand how everything had gone so wrong. "Why?" she whispered. "Why are you doing this?" I answered honestly, "I'm not doing anything." "Caroline, you are." She lowered her head. The cruiser doors closed. Diesel leaned against me, calming now that the threat had passed. For the first time, I truly believed the storm was finally over. The following evening, the HOA board held another meeting. This one brief, decisive, unanimous. Caroline Briggs was permanently removed as HOA president. She was banned from holding any board position for life. The citations she had issued were voided. New bylaws were written to prevent any single person from wielding that much authority again. And as for me, the board publicly apologized. Neighbors applauded. Jim shook my hand firmly and said, "Thank you for standing up. You reminded us what leadership actually looks like." I glanced down at Diesel. "He did most of the work," I said. Everyone laughed, but they knew. Diesel hadn't been a weapon. He'd been a boundary, and in a community ruled by someone who ignored every boundary imaginable, he'd been exactly what we needed. As I walked home under the streetlights, Diesel trotting confidently at my side, I felt something I hadn't felt in weeks. Safety, relief, closure, but most of all, my driveway was finally mine again. In the end, this whole ordeal taught me something far bigger than how to deal with an out-of-control HOA president. It taught me that boundaries matter, not just the physical kind painted on concrete, but the personal kind we draw around our dignity, our peace, and our right to live without fear of someone abusing their authority. People like Caroline don't crumble when you yell. They don't stop when you ignore them. They stop when you hold firm, stay consistent, and refuse to let their chaos become your normal. If you've ever dealt with a bully HOA or otherwise, remember this. You don't need to shout to stand your ground. Sometimes you just need clarity, patience, a little documentation, and in my case, one very good dog. Comment below if you've ever faced an HOA nightmare, and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. Tap the link and watch the full video. And if you're not sure where to watch it, just click the title above.